Okay, welcome everyone to the deep dive. We're about to jump into a pretty interesting stack of source material you've gathered for us. It looks like it offers a very granular internal look at how the Democratic Party viewed the 2024 election aftermath.
Right. Yeah, we've got a mix here, articles, some personal accounts, even internal notes. It's material that really tries to bring us into the perspective from inside the Democratic Party, specifically focusing, on the world around Joe Biden and how they process the election results looking back.
Okay, so our mission today is pretty clear. Dig into all this stuff and pull out the most important insights. What does this specific set of documents tell us about why they think the loss happened, from their unique internal viewpoint, that is?
Exactly. What were the key factors, the internal dynamics as they're described in these sources? That's the focus.
And looking through it, this material has some really pointed observations. Sometimes quite surprising ones, actually.
Definitely. Like the way these sources portray this disconnect between Biden's own perception of his political strength, maybe, and what others around him were apparently seeing.
Yeah, and they talk about something called the original sin of the campaign.
And there are some incredibly candid, sometimes pretty harsh assessments from people who were, inside or close to the whole operation.
Absolutely. And look, we should be clear right up front. The sources you've provided, they definitely contain politically sensitive information. These are views from within one party about a major national event.
Right.
So our job here today is strictly to understand and present the perspectives, the arguments, the alleged facts that are contained within this specific source material. We're not here to endorse any particular viewpoint, left or right.
No, not at all. We're simply acting as guides, really, to show you what these particular documents are telling us.
Precisely. Think of us as just unpacking these specific pages for you. So let's get right into the narrative that's described here. Where does it start, maybe the morning after the election?
Yeah, right off the bat, these sources paint this picture of Joe Biden waking up convinced, not just that he'd lost, but that he'd been actively wronged in some way.
Wronged. How so?
The narrative here is that he felt the elites, Democratic officials, the media, maybe even figures like Nancy Pelosi and Barack Obama shouldn't have pushed him aside. He believed, according to these sources, that he would have beaten Donald Trump. And the sources say he kept citing polls he claimed supported this view.
Okay, but what do the sources say about those polls?
Well, that's what's striking. The material immediately contrasts that internal belief. It quotes Biden's own pollsters right there in these documents, saying basically no such credible data existed.
Really?
Yeah. All their unspun information, as the sources put it, suggested it would have been a loss for him, too, and potentially a much larger one than the loss Vice President Harris ultimately experienced.
So we see this theme emerging immediately in these documents. There's a pretty significant disconnect described between Biden's self-perception and the data others were looking at.
Exactly. And the sources suggest this wasn't like a new thing. It was maybe a constant throughout his administration. There was this feeling among many insiders, apparently, that his closest circle was kind of shielding him from difficult truths or bad news.
And the material also brings up this interesting question, doesn't it? About why the public seemed to conclude he was too old, maybe long before many insiders or officials did.
Right. And the sources allege that, in the lead up to that really critical June 27th debate, many insiders who had a closer view of Biden's condition saw things that were, well, quite concerning.
But they didn't speak up.
But most remained silent, is what the sources claim. They rationalize their inaction for various reasons described in the material.
Okay, and this seems to be where the sources introduce that central concept they use to explain the outcome. They point to what they call the original sin of election 2024. What exactly are they referring to with that phrase?
So according to these documents we're looking at, the original sin was Biden's decision to actually run for re-election in the first place.
Just the decision itself.
The decision itself. And this action, they argue, was then compounded by what they describe as pretty aggressive efforts to conceal or, downplay his alleged cognitive diminishment.
And then came the debate. The sources describe it. Well, how do they put it?
Yeah, the material claims the June 27th debate against Trump was the moment where, and this is the quote they use, Biden's decline was laid bare before the world.
Wow. And they push back, don't they, on the idea it was just a bad night or that he had a cold or something?
They really do. They state pretty bluntly that this performance was the natural result of an 81-year-old man whose capabilities had been diminishing for years. That's the language in the sources.
That's strong language.
It is. And they explicitly say that while millions watching were shocked, some Democrats weren't surprised at all. because, allegedly, they'd seen him like this behind closed doors, but, like we said, had remained silent.
Which, in the view presented in these sources, left the Democrats going into the fall campaign with an untested nominee, Kamala Harris, and facing what they describe as this growing public mistrust of a White House that had been gaslighting the American people.
Yep, the sources really emphasized the immense challenge the Harris campaign then faced. They had, what, only 107 days to run what one source quotes David Plouffe as calling a rescue mission.
A rescue mission.
That's the term used. And look, they acknowledged the Harris campaign had its own errors, sure. But for many knowledgeable Democrats and top campaign members cited here, the conclusion was apparently quite clear. They quote someone saying, "There was no question about the father of this election calamity. It was Joe Biden."
Wow, that is some powerful language cited directly in these sources. You mentioned Plouffe, he's quoted pretty bluntly.
Oh, yeah. The material quotes him directly saying things like, "We got so screwed by Biden as a party, and even he totally fucked us," referring specifically to Biden's decision to run and then his delayed withdrawal.
And the sources emphasize this isn't just sour grapes or typical political finger-pointing.
Right. They make a point of saying this is a deep-seated sentiment described within this material, not just post-election blame shifting.
Okay. And they trace the idea of Biden being just a one-term bridge president? Where does that idea originate, according to the sources?
They trace it way back, actually. Back to December 2019, before the 2020 primaries had even properly started.
Despite that initial idea, his senior advisors, his family, they supported him running again.
According to these sources, yes. They supported his decision to run again, potentially even serving, through to age 86.
And the sources are clear. The issue, as they frame it, it wasn't just his age chronologically.
No, not simply the number. It was what they describe as clear limitations of his abilities, which got worse throughout his presidency. They claim what the public saw was concerning, sure, but what was going on in private was worse.
Yeah.
That's another quote from the material.
Okay, let's unpack that a little. What specific details are the sources actually giving us about this perceived decline happening in private?
Well, they detail alleged issues like limits to his reliable functioning hours in a day, freezing up sometimes, losing his train of thought mid-sentence, forgetting names even of longtime aides and friends, and communication impairments they say were unrelated to his known stutter.
Right.
And crucially, these sources claim Biden and his immediate inner circle refused to admit this reality until the very, very end of his presidency, and that they actively tried to hide it through various means.
This idea of a culture of denial, that seems to be a major thread running through the sources we have here.
It really is. There's one anecdote describing a top Democrat who was publicly defending the president, but repeatedly calling White House officials in 2023 and early 2024, sort of seeking reassurance privately.
And what were they told?
They were told, he's fine, he's fine, he's fine, by key aides cited in the material, people like Anita Dunn, Jeff Zients, Mike Donilon.
But this Democrat later had a different experience.
Exactly. According to the sources, this person later met with the first couple after Biden had withdrawn from the race. And they saw the reality firsthand, describing him later as clearly not fucking fine. And alleging the First Lady had to actually complete some of his thoughts for him.
Wow.
Which led this person to feel that the aides had to have moments where they saw it wasn't okay. And they started questioning, why didn't they intervene sooner?
And there are other voices quoted saying similar things.
Yes, another prominent Democratic strategist, someone who also publicly defended Biden, is quoted in this material saying, "It was an abomination. He stole an election from the Democratic Party. He stole it from the American people."
That's incredibly strong.
It is. The sources argue that by not being honest, allegedly, about his decline and relinquishing power sooner, Biden, who, remember, framed his whole presidency as preventing Trump's return, actually ended up guaranteeing it in the view presented here.
The sources also try to dig into the origins of this alleged denial, right? And the insular nature of Biden's inner circle, sometimes referred to as the Politburo in this material.
Yeah, they do. They trace some of those protective instincts, that avoidance of transparency, back to how the family handled Beau Biden's health issues years earlier.
That's a powerful parallel the sources are drawing there. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. They detail Beau's brain tumor diagnosis back in 2013, the very private nature of his treatments, the use of aliases like George Lincoln for appointments, and the internal debate within the family and the team about how much, if anything, to disclose publicly.
And ultimately,
According to these sources, they said basically nothing publicly about the severity of his illness, despite him being Delaware's attorney general at the time, an elected official.
And they claim Biden himself sometimes instructed his team to mislead the media about his whereabouts.
Yes. When he was actually traveling to be with Beau during treatment, the sources allege he told staff to obscure that fact.
Yeah.
And this behavior, according to the sources, demonstrated the Bidens' capacity for denial and the lengths they would go to avoid transparency about health issues.
So the sources are suggesting this created a kind of precedent, a blueprint for how the team handled Joe Biden's own alleged decline later on.
That's the argument presented in the material, yes. They describe this inner circle, figures like Mike Donnellan, Steve Ricchetti, Bruce Reed, as intensely loyal. Some have worked with Biden for decades, creating these almost familial ties.
And how did this loyalty manifest, according to the sources?
Well, they highlight how these aides, particularly Donnellan, were extremely protective and sometimes very resistant to any doubts expressed about Biden. There's an anecdote about Donnellan snapping, "Don't take this away from him," regarding a potential 2016 presidential run Biden was considering. And while some, like Ricchetti, apparently did see age as a potential political vulnerability early on, maybe floating a one-term commitment idea, the sources claim this core group mostly approached concerns about Biden's age as just another political messaging problem to manage, not necessarily a reflection of his actual limitations or abilities.
The sources also bring in perspectives from the 2020 campaign itself, noting worries among aides even back then.
They do. After events like a grueling bus tour where he allegedly struggled to remember Mike Donnellan's name, someone he's known forever, they describe aides sensing he wasn't always the guy he used to be, wincing through debates, sometimes struggling to communicate effectively.
They talk about two Bidens.
Yeah, that phrase comes up, moments of high energy and clarity contrasting with what they describe as other times when he was meandering and subdued.
And they note that aides knew privately that voters were seeing a diminished man, even back in early 2020.
Yes, and that voters were apparently less likely to support him after seeing him at events sometimes, which is quite telling.
Despite all this, the sources say the campaign team genuinely believed he was still sharp enough and the best candidate to beat Trump.
That's what they claim, yes. They believed his decision-making was sound. And then, after he won a nomination, helped by those late endorsements and big Super Tuesday wins, Biden and his team saw it as a kind of affirmation. They tuned out the critics, even though, as the sources point out, the 2020 victory itself was actually quite narrow in key electoral college states.
Now, these sources offer a really fascinating, maybe slightly dark perspective on the COVID-19 pandemic's impact on that 2020 campaign.
Oh, absolutely. They quote Biden's own aides saying that while it was obviously terrible for the world, the pandemic was actually one of the best things to happen to Biden's presidential hopes.
Why do they say that?
Because, according to the sources, it allowed him to essentially avoid the grueling travel schedule of a normal campaign. He could campaign remotely from his home in Wilmington, Delaware, which gave him essential rest.
And this changed the internal power dynamics?
That's the argument. It put aides like Annie Tomasini and Anthony Bernal, who were physically with the Bidens in Wilmington, in constant contact. And this gave them significant influence within the campaign world, according to these sources.
And these aides are described as intensely loyal.
Extremely loyal, with a very protective instinct. And the sources claim they sometimes went to significant lengths, like allegedly loading written Q&As into a teleprompter for Biden to use during local media interviews conducted via Zoom, something campaign leadership apparently confronted them about eventually.
Wow.
Yeah, the sources claim the team was constantly trying to change the Zoom configurations and production designs to adapt to him, because they felt they couldn't always rely on him to stay on message or even follow a conversation effectively.
This protective instinct, this alleged attempt to manage his performance, it's highlighted again when the sources talk about the 2020 Democratic National Convention prep, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. There was a creative team struggling with how to make Biden, who's described in this material as starting to founder communication skills, appear empathetic and authentic remotely, which is hard enough anyway.
So what did they try?
They tried setting up these video calls with real Americans, hoping for spontaneous, heartfelt moments. But the sources quote top Democrats involved in reviewing the raw footage, and they describe it as horrible, claiming Biden couldn't follow the conversation at all and sometimes looked like grandpa who shouldn't be driving. That's a direct quote cited.
Goodness.
They apparently had to bring in a special editing team to heavily cut down these videos just to get a few usable minutes for the convention broadcast.
And what was the reaction of the Democrats who saw this raw footage?
Well, according to the sources, two of these top Democrats, reflecting on it later, felt dumbfounded. They couldn't understand how Biden could possibly be capable of being president after what they had allegedly witnessed.
And this led to some strong feelings.
Yes. According to these sources, it led some top Democrats into what they called an angry phase, feeling disillusioned with the entire apparatus, and concluding that the people working closely with Biden every single day must have seen this alleged decline too, and were essentially gaslighting everyone else about it.
But the sources do include a counter perspective on this specific incident.
They do, it's important to note. They mentioned two other Democrats who were involved who thought the first two were overstating it. They blamed the awkwardness they saw more on the difficult Zoom format itself rather than Biden's capacity. So there's nuance there in the accounts.
Okay. And the sources also touch briefly on the issue of those viral clips of Biden that circulated online.
Right. They note that while many of those clips were unfair, maybe taken out of context or even outright bogus, they were still difficult for the campaign to counter effectively.
Why was that?
Because, the sources argue, they seem to reaffirm an underlying pre-existing belief among many voters that Biden just seemed old and was prone to misspeaking a belief that, according to these specific sources, was unfortunately rooted in some truth.
Stepping back a bit, these sources repeatedly come back to this idea of the Biden mythology. This concept seems central to their explanation.
Absolutely central. It's rooted in his father's famous mantra, get up. You know, the idea that the art of living is simply getting up after you've been knocked down. This is presented as absolutely crucial to understanding why Biden decided to run again for re-election despite the concerns.
Right. The sources chronicle his life story, the many setbacks, personal and political.
Exactly. Overcoming a stutter as a kid, winning that surprise Senate race early on, the absolutely devastating loss of his first wife and daughter, surviving brain aneurysms, those failed presidential runs in '88 and '08, the tragic death of his son Beau, Hunter's very public struggle.
It's an incredible list of challenges.
It is. And the sources argue this long history fostered this deep-seated belief, both in him and, crucially, in his inner circle, in his almost supernatural ability to defy odds and survive anything. So the idea that mere age or some ailment would actually stop him seemed almost unfathomable to them.
And within that inner circle, this mythology became something more.
The sources describe it as becoming almost a theology, a belief system where skepticism was forbidden. Aides were simply not permitted to demonstrate doubt, creating what the sources call a strange circle of groupthink.
They even mention a private family saying?
Yes, they cite this saying, never call a fat person fat, which they interpret within this material as being fundamentally about ignoring ugly facts, or maybe don't say mean truths out loud. And this attitude, combined with what the sources describe as Biden's alleged gift for living in their own reality and sometimes creating it, led to what these documents call an almost spiritual refusal to admit that Biden was declining all the way from 2020 through 2024.
So, okay, when we look at the actual 2024 election outcome, where Vice President Harris lost those key swing states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, by relatively narrow margins, what are the sources saying?
Well, they pose that big what-if question that seems to haunt some of the Democrats described in this material. Michigan was lost by just 1.44%, Pennsylvania by 1.73%, Wisconsin by only 0.87%. Tiny margins.
So the question is?
The question is, what if Biden hadn't run for re-election in the first place? Or what if he had acknowledged his condition, as the sources describe it, and dropped out much earlier than he did?
And what's the view on that within these sources? Like from David Plouffe, whom you mentioned.
According to sources like Plouffe cited in the material, a competitive primary process starting much earlier would likely have produced a stronger nominee.
Stronger how?
Someone more tested by debates, maybe more comfortable taking questions from the press. Someone who'd had time to fully introduce themselves to the country, flesh out their own policy ideas, and importantly, forge a path that respectfully but forcefully distanced themselves from the incumbent president, who was perceived by many voters, rightly or wrongly, as unpopular.
And the sources argue it's hard to say that such a candidate wouldn't have made up those small margins.
That's the argument they make. It's difficult to definitively say that a candidate produced through a robust contested primary wouldn't have been able to capture those small percentages needed in those key swing states.
And they link this back to the timing of Biden's withdrawal.
Yes, they claim that once the debate made it undeniable that Biden needed to step aside, figures like Obama and Pelosi pushed for an open primary process, even in July and August. But Biden's delayed withdrawal until July 21st, coupled with his immediate endorsement of Harris, effectively shut down that possibility, according to these documents. It prevented a real contest.
Okay. So pulling all of this together then, what's the central sort of takeaway from this specific stack of sources we've been discussing?
Well, they paint a pretty clear picture where, in their view, the primary cause, the root cause of the 2024 Democratic loss was Joe Biden's decision to run for re-election, a decision made despite what these sources describe as significant cognitive and physical decline.
And a decline they claim was known internally.
Yes, they claim this reality was known to many insiders, but was actively managed, concealed, and denied by his closest circle. And they trace that pattern back to a mix of things: personal ambition, perhaps, intense loyalty, certainly, and this deep-seated Biden mythology of always overcoming adversity.
And this created a situation that ultimately hampered the nominee.
Exactly. According to these sources, it created a situation where the eventual nominee, Kamala Harris, had severely limited time, faced significant hurdles intrinsically tied to the incumbent she was replacing, and ultimately fell short by margins they believe a stronger primary tested candidate potentially could have overcome.
It's certainly a narrative from within a segment of the party. It seems very directly assigning responsibility as these specific sources see it.
It is. It's a powerful perspective, maybe even a raw one.
Yeah.
Presented very directly in the specific material we've examined.
Okay, so based only on everything we've discussed from these sources today, here's a final thought for you, our listener, to consider. Given the detailed accounts within these specific documents about the internal awareness of what they describe as Biden's decline and the alleged efforts to manage or conceal it, what does this particular narrative suggest about the intersection of personal ambition, loyalty, and political consequence right at the very highest levels of power? Something to mull over, drawing purely from the